I noticed the silence before I noticed the empty seats. The doors at the back of the chapel closed behind me, and for half a second, everything felt normal. Soft music, guests standing, Caleb turning around with that nervous smile he always gets when he's trying not to show emotion. My hand tightened around his without thinking. His palm was warm, steady. Exactly what I needed in that moment. Then my eyes shifted left. 3 full rows, empty, not late, not filling in, not people standing in the aisle. Just rows of polished wooden chairs with no coats, no purses, no familiar faces leaning out to whisper or wave. The side reserved for my family looked like no one had ever planned to sit there at all. I kept walking because that's what you do when everyone is watching. You don't stop. You don't turn around. You don't ask questions out loud. You walk forward and pretend the tight feeling in your chest is just nerves and not something sharper. Someone cleared their throat near the front. I heard a few whispers ripple through the room, not loud enough to be rude, but loud enough to land. A woman I didn't recognize glanced from the empty rows back to me, then away, like she just realized she was staring. Caleb squeezed my hand again. He didn't look at the chairs. He looked straight at me like if he didn't acknowledge them, they might disappear. They didn't. I stood at the altar facing him and tried to focus on his voice as the officiant began. The words were familiar. I'd heard them at other weddings. Love, commitment, family. The irony didn't escape me, but I didn't react. Years in the military had taught me how to keep my face neutral when my head was anything but. From the corner of my eye, I could see my coworkers from the base, a few friends from training Caleb's parents in the front row smiling a little too brightly. His mom gave me a small nod like she was trying to tell me something without saying it out loud. I nodded back. Nobody asked where my family was, not out loud, not yet. When the ceremony ended, the room filled with applause. Chairs scraped. People moved. The noise returned all at once like someone had turned the volume back up. Caleb leaned in and whispered that everything was okay. I nodded again because nodding is easy. At the back of the chapel, one of my aunts was supposed to be standing. If my father had been there, he would have insisted on walking me down the aisle even though I'd told him years ago I didn't need that. My mother would have cried through the whole thing. My sister would have corrected everyone about the schedule and complained about the lighting. None of them were there. Outside, the air was cold but bright. Late fall in Colorado has that clean, sharp feel that wakes you up, whether you want it to or not. People hugged me, congratulated us, said how beautiful everything was. A coworker joked that at least the weather cooperated. Someone asked where we were going for the reception. Then it happened. A woman I barely knew, a +1, of a +1, smiled politely and said, "So, your family couldn't make it." She didn't mean anything by it. That almost made it worse. I said something vague. Travel issues. Timing. I don't even remember the exact words. Caleb stepped closer, slid an arm around my back, and smoothly redirected the conversation. He'd always been good at reading rooms. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. By the time we reached the reception hall, I'd checked my phone 6 times. No missed calls, no texts, nothing. I wasn't expecting a parade. I wasn't expecting apologies or speeches. But I had expected something. A message. A late excuse. A "we're on the way" lie. Even silence with context would have been better than this. At our table, Caleb's dad leaned over and quietly asked if everything was okay. I said yes, because that's what you say when you don't want to make your problem someone else's problem. He didn't push. He just nodded and handed me a glass of water like he'd done this before. Halfway through dinner, I stepped outside under the excuse of getting some air. The parking lot was quiet. Mountains in the distance. String lights glowing over the entrance. I pulled my phone out again, more out of habit than hope. Still nothing. That was when I realized this wasn't a last-minute emergency or miscommunication. This was a choice. I leaned against the cold brick wall and tried to run through possibilities like I was planning a mission. Flat tire, hospital visit, weather delay. None of them explained everyone. Not my parents, not my sister, not a single person. Caleb found me a few minutes later. He didn't ask questions. He just stood next to me, hands in his pockets, staring out at the lot. "They didn't come," I said. He nodded once. I know. That was it. No judgment, no disbelief, just acknowledgement. Back inside, the DJ announced the first dance. I walked back in with my head up because pride is a funny thing. It shows up even when everything else leaves. I danced. I smiled when I was supposed to. I laughed when someone made a joke. If anyone noticed the empty side of the guest list, no one said it to my face. By the end of the night, my feet hurt and my cheeks ached from holding expressions that didn't match how I felt. When we finally got back to the hotel, I kicked off my shoes, sat on the edge of the bed, and checked my phone one last time before plugging it in. Still nothing. No message from my mother. No missed call from my father. No sarcastic comment from my sister. It was like I'd disappeared from their lives without warning, even though I was the one who had shown up. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I'd learned the hard way that assumptions can do real damage. I told myself we'd talk later, that there had to be a reason, that families don't just skip weddings without one. But even as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever explanation I eventually got wouldn't make this feel any better, and that the silence I was sitting in wasn't the end of something awkward, but the beginning of something deliberate, something that had already been decided without me being part of the conversation at all. My phone buzzed against the nightstand just after sunrise, loud enough to jolt me upright before I was fully awake. For half a second, I thought it might be my mother, or my father, or anyone who could explain what had happened without making it worse. I grabbed the phone thumb, already moving before my eyes were fully open. It wasn't them. It was a group text from Caleb's aunt, thanking us again for a beautiful wedding and apologizing if she'd said something awkward the night before. I typed back a polite reply, set the phone down, and stared at the wall until the room came into focus. Caleb was still asleep beside me. I didn't wake him. There was nothing he could fix, and I didn't want my first words of the morning to be about my family. I slipped out of bed, pulled on a sweatshirt, and sat at the small desk by the window. Outside traffic moved like any other weekday. People going to work. Normal life continuing without waiting for me to catch up. I opened my messages and scrolled. Nothing. I checked missed calls, voicemail, email. Even the old family group chat we barely used anymore. The last message there was from months ago, a reminder from my sister Megan about a holiday schedule that never happened. Megan. The thought landed heavier than it should have. I hadn't spoken to her directly in weeks, but that wasn't unusual. Megan liked to manage people from a distance. She was the kind of person who always knew what was best for everyone else and made sure they knew it too. I typed a short message, just her name. No punctuation, no emotion. I stared at it for a full minute before hitting send. The dots appeared almost immediately. Hey, she wrote. Everything okay? That alone told me more than I wanted to know. If she didn't know why I was texting, then she knew exactly why. Why didn't anyone come? I wrote. The dots disappeared, reappeared, disappeared again. A minute passed, then another. Finally, we didn't think you wanted us there. I felt my jaw tighten. What are you talking about? Another pause. Then, you've been really distant. Mom said you didn't even call before sending the invites. I read that twice. Then a third time. I sent handwritten notes, I typed. You know that. She replied quickly this time. They felt cold. I almost laughed. I hadn't realized weddings came with a temperature requirement. So you decided to skip it, I wrote. It wasn't just me, Megan said. Dad didn't feel welcome either. That one landed harder. My father didn't feel welcome in my life. In my wedding, I set the phone down for a moment, pressed my fingers against my forehead, and took a slow breath. Years of training had taught me not to react on instinct, especially when something felt off. I picked the phone back up. Did you tell them not to come? The dots appeared. Stayed longer this time. I told them you didn't want a scene, she finally wrote. A scene. At my own wedding. What scene? I asked. She didn't answer right away. When she did, it wasn't to explain. You've changed, she wrote. Ever since the military. There it was. The phrase Megan used whenever she wanted to shut a conversation down. Not an argument, a diagnosis. I didn't respond. I locked the phone and stared out the window again, watching a delivery truck back into a loading zone across the street. The driver hopped out, slammed the door, went about his business. No drama, no hidden meanings, just cause and effect. Caleb came up behind me a few minutes later, wrapped his arms around my shoulders, and rested his chin on my head. I didn't move. "She answer?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Not really." He didn't push. He knew better than that. He poured coffee, slid a mug across the desk, and sat on the edge of the bed. Later that afternoon, my phone started buzzing again. This time, it wasn't Megan. It was my cousin Lauren, someone I'd grown up with and trusted enough to be honest when things got uncomfortable. "I didn't know what was going on," she said when I answered. "Megan told us you wanted it small, that you didn't want family drama." I closed my eyes. "What drama?" I asked. "She said Dad tried to talk to you and you shut him down. That you were embarrassed by us." Embarrassed. Another word I'd never used about my family now being used against me. "Did you ask me?" I said. There was a pause on the line. I should have, Lauren admitted. After we hung up, I sat there holding the phone, feeling something shift from confusion into something colder and more focused. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't hurt feelings spiraling out of control. It was messaging. Coordinated. Repeated. Megan hadn't just filled in gaps. She'd written the story for them. That night, I pulled up the guest list from the wedding site and started making calls. Not emotional ones, just factual. I asked what they'd been told. I listened without interrupting. The answers followed the same pattern. Different words, same meaning. She said you wanted space. She said you were overwhelmed. She said you didn't want people watching you, watching me. By the time I set this phone down, my hands were steady in a way they hadn't been the day before. This was familiar territory now. Information, patterns, intent. Caleb leaned against the counter and watched me quietly. "This wasn't accidental," he said. "No," I replied. "It wasn't." Later I texted Megan one last time. "I know what you told them," I wrote. "Why?" She responded almost instantly. "I was protecting you." I stared at that sentence until it blurred. Protecting me from what? My own wedding, my own family. By lying, I asked. Her reply came slower this time. By keeping things from getting worse. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say that would change her mind, and I wasn't interested in another version of events designed to make her the hero. Instead, I opened my calendar and started reviewing the weeks ahead. Training schedules, travel, commitments I could control. If my family wanted distance, I could respect that. What I wouldn't do was chase people who had decided I was easier to manage from afar. That night, as I set my phone face down on the dresser, I made a quiet decision. I wasn't going to defend myself to rumors. I wasn't going to beg for explanations. And I wasn't going to let someone else keep speaking for me while pretending it was for my own good. The silence I'd woken up to that morning no longer felt empty. It felt intentional. And now that I could see the shape of it, I understood that whatever Megan had started didn't end with empty chairs. It just moved more quietly the way things do when they're meant to spread without being questioned. I pressed the ignition button and let the engine idle longer than necessary, my hands resting on the steering wheel, like I was waiting for instructions that weren't coming. The base entrance was already busy. Morning traffic moved in steady lines, security checks routine and unremarkable. I rolled down the window, handed over my ID, and nodded to the guard who recognized me. He waved me through without comment. Inside the gate, everything made sense again. Rules were clear. Lines existed for a reason. That was always the contrast. On base, decisions followed structure. At home, they followed whoever spoke the loudest. I parked, grabbed my bag, and walked toward the operations building, boots hitting the pavement in a rhythm I'd memorized years ago. The cold air kept me sharp. I needed that. I needed my head clear because the longer I sat with Megan's words, the more one memory kept pushing its way forward. It hadn't started with the wedding. It had started during a short leave years earlier when I'd flown back thinking I was just going home for a few quiet days. Megan had picked me up from the airport, talking fast the whole drive, filling the silence with updates I hadn't asked for. Bills, repairs, stress. She always liked to set the tone early. Halfway to the house, she mentioned the problem. Casual at first, like it was already solved. "They're coming down hard on Dad," she said. "The lender doesn't care about timing or excuses." I asked what she meant. She waved it off, told me not to worry yet. By the time we pulled into the driveway, worry was already there. That night after dinner, Megan waited until Mom cleared the table and Dad stepped outside to take a call. She slid a folder across the kitchen counter toward me. "I need you to look at something," she said. Inside were documents I didn't recognize at first. Loan notices, deadlines, a property valuation that had been circled in red ink. "They need proof of income," she said. "Or backing. Something official." I flipped through the pages slowly. This isn't my lane. She leaned against the counter. It could be. That was when she said it. Not directly. Not in writing. Just enough to test the line. "You have access," she said. "You know people. You could vouch for something temporary, just to buy time." I closed the folder. "What you're asking for is illegal," I said. She smiled like I'd misunderstood her. "I'm asking for help. Help." That word had always been Megan's favorite shield. If she called it help, then anyone who refused became the problem. "I can't," I said. "Not like that." Her expression shifted. Not angry, evaluating. "You've changed," she said. "You used to be more flexible." "I follow rules now," I replied. "That's not the same thing." She didn't argue. She didn't need to. She just nodded, gathered the papers, and said she'd figure something else out. I went to bed thinking the conversation was over. It wasn't. The next morning, Dad cornered me in the garage while I was loading my bag into the rental car. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He just looked tired. "Megan says you won't help," he said. "I can't," I replied. "Not the way she wants. She says it's temporary. That's how it always starts." He rubbed his forehead, stared at the floor. "You know what happens if we lose this place." I did. And for a moment I felt it. The pull to fix something, to bend just enough to make the problem go away. That moment passed quickly. "I won't risk my career," I said. "Or my integrity." That was the first time I saw disappointment in his eyes that wasn't mixed with pride. I left that afternoon and went back to my unit. Back to schedules and briefings and expectations that didn't shift based on family pressure. I didn't think about the folder again. Not until months later when Megan started dropping comments during phone calls. "You wouldn't understand," she'd say. "It's different when it's your responsibility. Some people don't get to hide behind rules." Each comment landed where it was meant to. By the time the wedding planning started, that decision had already been rebranded in her version of events. It wasn't about legality anymore. It was about loyalty, about choosing sides, about who I was willing to stand with when things got uncomfortable. Standing in the hallway outside the briefing room now, I adjusted my uniform and exhaled slowly. That choice hadn't felt dramatic at the time. It had felt obvious, necessary. The kind of decision you make once and then build your life around. I stepped inside, took my seat, and focused on the screen as the briefing began. Timelines, logistics, risk assessments. This was familiar, predictable, the opposite of the chaos Megan thrived in. Afterward, one of my supervisors pulled me aside and asked how married life was treating me. I said it was good. That was true. At least part of it was. During lunch, I checked my phone. No new messages from my family. Megan hadn't reached out again. That didn't surprise me. She never liked conversations she couldn't control. What surprised me was how clear everything felt once I stopped trying to justify myself to people who had already decided I was wrong. That decision years ago hadn't just protected my career. It had marked me. It had turned me into the problem in a story where the truth was inconvenient. And once I accepted that, a lot of things started to make sense. The cold distance, the rewritten narratives, the sudden unity against me. When I left the base that evening, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the lot. I sat in my car again, engine running, and thought about how easy it would have been to say yes back then. How much simpler everything might have looked on the surface. It wouldn't have lasted. Some lines don't announce themselves. You only see them after you've crossed them or chosen not to. I'd chosen not to. And whether my family admitted it or not, that choice had changed how they saw me long before any wedding invitation went out. I tossed my phone onto the passenger seat and watched it slide slightly as I pulled out of the parking lot, the screen still dark from the message I'd just read. It was from Megan. Not a question. Not an explanation. Just a short update that didn't ask for a response. "Mom's been really stressed. Dad thinks you should give everyone some space." Space. That word again. It showed up whenever Megan wanted distance without admitting she'd created it. I drove home with the radio off, letting the quiet sit with me. By the time I reached our driveway, the irritation had settled into something steadier. I wasn't angry anymore. I was alert. Inside, Caleb was at the kitchen table, laptop open, reviewing seating charts that no longer mattered. He looked up when I came in and raised an eyebrow. "Another family check-in?" he asked. "More like a family directive," I said, setting my keys down. "Apparently, I'm supposed to disappear for a while." He closed the laptop. "Do you want to?" "No," I said. But I think they already decided I would. Over the next few days, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I didn't hear directly from my parents. Everything came through Megan. She spoke for them, filtered their words, summarized their feelings. If I asked a direct question, she answered with a general statement. If I pushed for clarity, she reframed it as concern. "She's just trying to help," Mom texted once, the only message I received from her that week. It sounded rehearsed. I called my father that night. It rang until voicemail. The next morning, I sent a simple follow-up. "Can we talk?" No response. But Megan called me later that afternoon. "I told them you're under a lot of pressure," she said. Her tone calm, reasonable. "They don't want to overwhelm you." "By cutting me out?" I asked. "By giving you space," she corrected. I almost admired how easily she did it. How every move was framed as kindness, every silence as protection. That weekend, a wedding card arrived in the mail. It was addressed to both Caleb and me, signed by a family friend I hadn't seen in years. Inside was a short note congratulating us and mentioning how sorry they were they couldn't attend given everything they'd heard. I read it twice. "What did they hear?" Caleb asked. I didn't answer right away. I turned the card over, checked the envelope. No return address. No clues. Just enough information to confirm what I already suspected. I started reaching out again, this time more deliberately. Not emotional calls, just direct ones. "Hey, it's me. Wanted to clear something up. Did Megan tell you I didn't want family at the wedding? Can you tell me exactly what she said?" Some people didn't respond. Others sounded uncomfortable but honest. "She said you didn't want anyone watching you," one cousin admitted. "She said you were trying to keep things clean and professional," another said. "She said Dad would make things awkward." Each version painted me as distant, controlling, embarrassed. Not cruel, not malicious, just cold enough to justify staying away. By the third call, I stopped taking notes. The details didn't matter anymore. The intent did. Megan wasn't reacting. She was shaping. That realization shifted something in me. I stopped asking for explanations and started paying attention to timing. When messages went out. Who heard what first? How quickly the narrative spread without anyone checking with me. One evening, Caleb sat on the couch scrolling through his phone while I stood at the window, watching our neighbor wrestle a trash can back into place after the wind knocked it over. "She's managing this like a campaign," he said. I nodded. She always does. Growing up, Megan had been the organizer, the planner, the one who spoke confidently in rooms where others hesitated. People listened to her because it was easier than questioning her. I'd spent years assuming that made her reliable. I saw it differently now. A few days later, my mother finally called. Her voice sounded thin, tired. "Why didn't you talk to us?" she asked. "I tried," I said. "I still am." Megan said you needed time. I closed my eyes. "Mom, did you ask me?" There was a pause. Not a long one. Just long enough. "No," she said quietly. That was the moment it stopped being about misunderstandings. Silence became a choice. Delegation became abdication. Megan wasn't just speaking for the family. They were letting her. After we hung up, I sat at the table and stared at the wood grain beneath my hands. The anger I expected never showed up. Instead, there was a strange clarity. A recognition that whatever this was, it wasn't going to resolve itself through patience. Later that week, Megan sent another message. This one longer. "People are worried about you," she wrote. "You've been distant for a while. Ever since the military, honestly. Maybe it's better if we slow things down." I read it carefully. The phrasing, the implication, the way she tied my career to my supposed behavior without saying it outright. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just about the wedding, or the past, or money. It was about control, about who got to define me when I wasn't in the room. Megan had lost leverage the moment I refused to bend years ago. This was her way of getting it back. I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled up my contacts and started a different kind of list. People I trusted. People who knew me outside of family roles. Coworkers, friends, mentors. I wasn't building a case. I was grounding myself in reality. That night, Caleb and I sat on the floor sorting through wedding gifts we hadn't opened yet. We laughed at the mismatched wrapping paper, joked about returning duplicates. Let ourselves enjoy the parts of the day that had actually gone right. My phone buzzed again. Megan, Dad thinks it's best if we keep things calm for now, she wrote. No surprises. I smiled despite myself. Calm. No surprises. Coming from someone who'd orchestrated my absence from my own wedding like a scheduling conflict. I set the phone face down and went back to unwrapping boxes, the sound of paper tearing clean and sharp in the quiet room. Whatever Megan thought she was containing wasn't staying contained. And the more she tried to manage the narrative, the clearer it became that this wasn't about peace at all. It was about pressure applied slowly until resistance felt unreasonable. I was reaching for a glass when the room went quiet in that specific way it does when something doesn't belong. The reception hall hadn't been loud to begin with. It was a weekday evening casual, just friends and a few coworkers who couldn't make the wedding but wanted to celebrate anyway. Plates clinked. Someone laughed near the bar. Then the front door opened, and the sound flattened like someone had pressed a hand down on it. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. They didn't look aggressive. No hands on belts, no raised voices. Just official enough to make everyone stop what they were doing. A few heads turned. A chair scraped. I felt Caleb shift beside me before I even saw who was behind them. Megan walked in last. She wore a neutral coat, hair pulled back, expression carefully measured. Not angry, not smug, concerned. The look she used when she wanted to appear reasonable to people who didn't know her well. She met my eyes and nodded like we were running into each other at a grocery store. Hannah, she said loud enough for the room. I'm glad you're here. One of the officers cleared his throat. Ma'am, are you Hannah Pierce? I set the glass down slowly. Yes. We need to speak with you for a moment. A moment. That's how these things always start. Caleb stepped forward. Is there a problem? The officer glanced at him, then back to me. We've received a complaint. We just need to ask a few questions. What kind of complaint? I asked. Megan answered before he could. It's just about some financial stuff, she said quickly. I didn't want to worry you, but it seemed better to handle it properly. Properly. She said it like she was doing me a favor. The room had gone still. People were pretending not to stare while staring anyway. A couple of my coworkers exchanged looks they didn't bother hiding. This wasn't a parking ticket. This wasn't a noise complaint. Everyone could feel that. I'm happy to cooperate, I said. But not here. The officer nodded. That's fine. We can step outside. Megan hesitated just for a second. It won't take long. I turned to her. You didn't have to do this here. She lowered her voice, but not enough. I didn't choose the timing. That was a lie, and we both knew it. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly like exhaust and wet pavement. The officers asked basic questions. Where I lived, whether I recognized certain account numbers, if I'd authorized any recent transfers. Nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic. But the implication was clear enough to travel back inside with us. One officer handed me a card. You may be contacted again. Am I being accused of something? I asked. We're just gathering information, he said. They left a few minutes later. Megan stayed. I didn't want it to escalate, she said, folding her arms. But you wouldn't talk to us. I stared at her. You brought police to my wedding reception. It's not your wedding, she said. It's a party. I almost laughed. That was new. Downgrading the event to minimize the damage. What did you tell them? I asked. She sighed like I was being difficult. That there were some irregularities. Accounts opened under Mom's name. Money missing. It looked like it might involve you. Looked like I repeated. She tilted her head. You have access. People assume things. People. Another shield. No one specific. Just an invisible group she could hide behind. Inside, Caleb was already fielding questions. He shut them down politely, efficiently. The way you do when you don't want rumors to take root. I put a hand on his arm and shook my head. Not now. We said our goodbyes early. In the car, neither of us spoke for a few minutes. The dashboard clock ticked over to 8:42. I watched the numbers change and thought about how many times Megan had complained that I was never on time for family events, how ironic it felt now. She planned that, Caleb said finally. Yes, I replied. She wanted witnesses. Back at home, I kicked off my shoes and went straight for my laptop. Not because I was panicking, because panic wastes time. I pulled bank statements I had access to. My own accounts. Clean, boring, predictable. I checked credit reports. Nothing out of place. No new lines, no surprises. Whatever Megan was talking about wasn't coming from my side. My phone buzzed again. Dad this time. What's going on? He wrote. I stared at the screen. He hadn't called. He hadn't asked before the police showed up. He was asking now after the fact, like this was all unfolding without his consent. Megan brought cops to the reception, I replied. She says there are missing funds. There was a long pause. Then, she's just trying to sort things out. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair. That sentence felt heavier than the officer's questions. Sorting things out. Like this was a mess that had appeared on its own. Did you know she was doing this? I asked. Another pause. She said it might be necessary. Necessary. That word again. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my work email. Nothing urgent. No alerts. No flags. That would come later, I knew. Things like this don't stay contained. They bleed into places they don't belong. I stood up and went into the bedroom, pulled a folder from the bottom drawer and laid it out on the bed. Copies of orders. Travel logs. Leave approvals. Paperwork. I'd kept out of habit more than fear. Proof of where I'd been and when. Caleb watched from the doorway. Do you think this is about money? He asked. Not really, I said. It's about leverage. I put the folder back and shut the drawer. Whatever Megan thought she'd accomplished tonight, it wasn't clarity. It was exposure. She'd taken something private and dragged it into the open under the guise of concern, counting on the shock to do the work for her. I checked my phone one more time before setting it down for the night. No follow-up from the officers. No apology from Megan. Just a short message from my mother. I hope you understand why this had to happen. I stared at the sentence, then placed the phone face down on the dresser. The room felt different now. Quieter, but not calmer. Like the air after a warning siren stops, when you realize the sound wasn't the danger. It was the signal. The notification hit my inbox while I was standing in line for coffee, my phone vibrating once against my palm before going still. I didn't open it right away. I already knew what it was. Messages that arrive before 7 a.m. on a weekday, sent from addresses that don't usually contact you directly, rarely bring good news. I stepped aside and opened it with one thumb. Pending administrative review. That was the subject line. No greeting, no context, just enough information to make your stomach tighten before you even read the rest. By the time I reached my car, I'd finished the message twice. An inquiry had been forwarded to my command. Nothing criminal, nothing formal. But my access was being temporarily limited until the review was complete. Standard procedure, they called it. Standard procedures have a way of ruining careers without ever sounding dramatic. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and stared at the dashboard, letting the implications line themselves up. Limited access meant no systems, no sensitive projects, no travel. It meant being sidelined without anyone having to accuse you of anything out loud. When I walked into the building later that morning, things felt off in subtle ways. A pause before a greeting. A second glance that lingered too long. No one said anything directly, but they didn't have to. News like that travels fast, even when it's not supposed to. My supervisor called me into her office mid-morning. She closed the door, motioned for me to sit, and folded her hands on the desk. This doesn't mean you did anything wrong, she said. I know, I replied. It's procedural. I know. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. We'll get through it. We. That mattered more than the words. Still, when I left her office, I felt the shift. My clearance badge still worked, but I didn't swipe into the usual areas. A meeting I was scheduled to lead went on without me. My calendar emptied itself quietly, one block at a time. At lunch, I ate alone. Not because anyone avoided me, but because I didn't feel like answering questions people didn't know how to ask. I checked my phone and found 3 missed calls from my father. I didn't return them. Megan, however, texted. I heard there might be some complications with work, she wrote. I hope you're okay. I set the phone down and finished my sandwich. That afternoon, an investigator from the administrative office requested a preliminary meeting. Neutral tone. Neutral language. He explained the process, what they needed, what they didn't. He emphasized fairness, due diligence, transparency. He also asked whether there were any ongoing family disputes that might explain the complaint. Yes, I said. There are. I didn't elaborate. Facts first, interpretations later. By the time I got home, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical work. Caleb was already there, sleeves rolled up a pot simmering on the stove. He didn't ask how my day was. He handed me a glass of water and waited. They limited my access, I said. For how long? Until they decide they don't need to anymore. He nodded once. Okay. That calm response grounded me more than reassurance would have. Panic invites mistakes. Calm invites strategy. That night I opened the folder again. Orders, travel logs, leave forms, emails confirming locations and times. Nothing flashy, just documentation. The kind that holds up when emotions don't. I also pulled my credit report again. Still clean. No new accounts. No late payments. No signs of financial chaos. Whatever accounts Megan was talking about weren't mine. The next morning, my mother called. I didn't think it would go this far, she said, her voice tight. Megan said it was just a formality. She involved law enforcement, I replied. That's not a formality. She was trying to protect the family. From what exactly went unasked? I asked a different question. Do you know what accounts she's talking about? There was a pause, longer than usual. There were some things opened under my name, she said quietly, to help Megan get through a rough patch. How long ago, I asked. Months. Did you tell me? No. That wasn't surprising. It was just confirming something I already felt. Silence wasn't accidental. It was structural. After the call, I sent a brief message to the investigator flagging the new information. No accusations, just facts, names, dates, documentation available upon request. At work, the review process moved forward without commentary. I complied with everything, answered questions directly, provided records without defensiveness. I'd learned early in my career that transparency beats persuasion every time. Still, the waiting did its damage. Not externally, internally. Doubt has a way of creeping in when your routine gets disrupted. You start replaying conversations, checking yourself for mistakes you didn't make. One afternoon, a colleague I trusted stopped by my desk. People are talking, she said quietly. Nothing official, just noise. I figured, I replied. They don't think it's serious. Noise still spreads, I said. She nodded. If you need anything, that offer mattered. It reminded me that while rumors travel fast, credibility lasts longer. That evening, as I pulled into the driveway, my phone buzzed again. Megan, I never wanted this to affect your career, she wrote. But you left us no choice. I stared at the message for a long moment. The phrasing, the deflection, the way responsibility was always somewhere else. I didn't reply. Instead, I sat in the car and made a list in my head. What I could control, what I couldn't, what needed to be documented, what needed to be ignored. The investigation wasn't about truth yet. It was about impressions. And impressions once formed don't shift on their own. Inside, Caleb had set the table. We ate, talked about ordinary things, let normal life exist alongside the uncertainty. When I went to bed later, I placed my phone face down on the nightstand again, not because I was avoiding it, but because I knew the next move wouldn't come from a notification. It would come from evidence. I slid the folder across the table and watched the investigator's pen pause mid-note. He didn't look surprised. He looked interested. There's a difference, and I'd learned to recognize it early in my career. These timestamps, he said, tapping the page. You're certain they're complete? They're generated automatically, I replied. No manual edits. Pulled directly from the system. He nodded and kept reading. The meeting wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no accusations, just a methodical walk through where I'd been, when, and why. The kind of conversation that rewards preparation and punishes guesswork. I'd stopped explaining myself days ago. Now I was just laying things out piece by piece and letting the facts do what they do best. Afterward, I sat in my car with the windows cracked, the late afternoon air moving slowly through the cabin. I didn't feel relieved. Relief comes after resolution. What I felt was steadier than that. Direction. At home, I spread everything out again, this time on the dining table. Bank statements my mother had forwarded. Copies of documents she hadn't fully understood when she signed them. Dates that lined up too neatly with Megan's financial dips. I didn't need to guess. The pattern was obvious once you stopped looking at it emotionally. Caleb leaned over my shoulder, reading quietly. These accounts, he said, they weren't opened all at once. No, I replied. They were staggered. Small amounts, different timing. Like someone trying not to trip alerts. Exactly. I picked up my phone and called my mother. I need you to be honest with me, I said when she answered. Did Megan handle all of this? There was a long exhale on the other end. She said it was temporary, my mother said. She said she'd fix it before anyone noticed. Did she? No. That answer carried more weight than any accusation. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't confused. It was tired. I hung up and opened my laptop, pulling up a calendar view that stretched back months. Leave approvals. Training blocks. Travel orders. The same routine I used when planning operations. Aligning movement with time. Removing emotion from logistics. Something clicked. The first questionable transaction had happened 3 days before my wedding invitation went out. The second, a week later. Right around the time Megan had started telling people I was hard to reach. She started this before the wedding, I said out loud. Caleb looked up. What? She was already setting the stage, I replied. Before anyone skipped anything. That realization reframed everything. The absence. The lies. The timing of the complaint. None of it was reactive. It was preventive. Megan wasn't responding to my wedding. She was protecting herself. The next day, I met with a forensic analyst assigned to the case. He walked me through metadata reports, device access logs, and transaction pathways. He didn't dramatize anything. He didn't need to. The data told the story clearly enough. These transfers, he said, pointing to a screen, they weren't initiated from your devices. I know. They were initiated from 2 locations. He continued, neither of which align with your verified locations at the time. He didn't say Megan's name. He didn't have to. Later that afternoon, my supervisor checked in again. Not formally, just a brief conversation in the hallway. They're taking this seriously, she said. That's good. I agree, I replied. She studied my face for a second. You're handling this well. I don't have a choice, I said. Back home, my phone buzzed with another message from Megan. I don't understand why you're dragging this out, she wrote. We could have handled this quietly. Quietly. That word meant something very different to her. I typed a response, then deleted it. Then typed another. Deleted that too. I wasn't interested in arguing anymore. Arguments create noise. Noise blurs facts. Instead, I forwarded the message to the investigator and added it to the file. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for the first time since the reception. The porch light was on. My father opened the door without a word. He looked older than I remembered. Or maybe he'd just run out of energy to hide it. We sat at the kitchen table. Same chairs. Different weight in the room. She didn't tell us everything, he said finally. No, I replied. She told you what she needed to. He stared at his hands. We thought you'd understand. I did, I said. Just not the way you hoped. My mother didn't speak much. She didn't need to. The documents on the table said enough. Dates, amounts, notes written in Megan's handwriting promising repayment that never came. She said you'd be fine, my father said quietly. That your job protected you. That one landed hard. Not because it was cruel, because it was revealing. I'm protected by rules, I said, not favors. He nodded slowly like he was hearing that for the first time. When I left, I didn't feel victorious. I felt focused. The kind of focus that comes when uncertainty burns off and leaves behind a single clear objective. At home, I added one last item to the folder. A timeline. Simple, clean, no opinions. Just dates and actions laid out in order. I'd stopped trying to convince anyone of who I was. Now I was just showing them what had happened. Caleb watched as I clipped the folder shut. You okay? He asked. I am, I said. And for the first time in days, that answer didn't feel like something I was saying to make it true. I set the folder by the door, ready for the next meeting, knowing that once facts start lining up, they don't stop just because someone wishes they would. I set the folder on the counter and waited while my mother flipped through it page by page slower than she needed to. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual. My father stood near the sink, arms crossed, staring at a spot on the wall like it might explain something if he looked long enough. Megan was the only one who hadn't moved. She leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching us the way she always did when she thought she already knew how things would end. "These are copies," my mother said quietly, more to herself than to me. "Yes," I replied. "The originals are with the investigators." She nodded and kept reading. No one spoke for a full minute. Then Megan sighed. "This is getting out of hand," she said. I turned to look at her. "You opened accounts under Mom's name." She agreed. Megan shot back. My mother's head snapped up. "You said it was paperwork." Megan didn't look at her. "It was paperwork." "That's not the same thing," my father said, his voice flat. Megan shifted her weight, irritation flashing across her face. "I told you we needed time. I told you Hannah would be fine." I didn't interrupt. I'd learned that people reveal more when you let them keep talking. "You always land on your feet," Megan continued, now looking directly at me. "You have a job that protects you. Connections. Stability. I didn't. That wasn't my responsibility," I said. Her expression hardened. "Family helps family. Family doesn't lie and call the police," I replied. The words landed heavier than I expected. My father flinched. My mother's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just closed the folder and placed her hands flat on top of it. "When were you going to tell us the truth?" she asked Megan. Megan shrugged. "When it was handled." "And if it hadn't been?" my mother asked. "It would have been," Megan said. "I always fix things." That sentence hung in the air, brittle and overconfident. My father pushed off the counter and walked to the table. He picked up one of the documents, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the numbers again. "This started before the wedding," he said. "Yes," I replied. He looked at Megan. "Before anyone skipped anything." Megan rolled her eyes. "That's not what this is about." "It is," I said. "You needed people on your side before questions started." My father sat down slowly. "You told us Hannah didn't want us there." Megan didn't deny it. She didn't. "That's not true," my mother said, her voice breaking just slightly. Megan finally looked at her. "She didn't want what we bring." The room went quiet again. That was the first honest thing she'd said. My mother turned to me. "Is that true?" "No," I said. "But even if it were, it still wouldn't justify this." Megan laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You don't get it. You left. You built a life where rules matter more than people. You don't understand what it's like to be stuck cleaning up everyone else's mess." "I didn't leave you with your mess," I said. "You made it." Her jaw tightened. "I asked for help." "You asked me to break the law," I replied. "Those aren't the same thing." My father rubbed his face with both hands. "You told us she'd be fine," he said to Megan. "You said this wouldn't touch her." Megan shrugged again. "She is fine. She's still standing, isn't she?" That was it. That was the line. I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, not sadness, but clarity. Megan wasn't confused. She wasn't desperate. She was calculating, and she believed that outcome mattered more than method. "I need to understand something," I said, keeping my voice even. "Did you expect me to take the fall?" Megan didn't hesitate. "I expected you to handle it." My mother let out a quiet sound halfway between a gasp and a sob. "Handle what?" she asked. "Losing her career." Megan turned to her, annoyed. "She wouldn't lose it. Worst case, she gets reassigned. People bounce back." "That's not your decision to make," my father said. Megan crossed her arms tighter. Someone had to make one. I watched my parents absorb that. The excuses fell away one by one. What was left wasn't a misunderstanding or a family disagreement. It was a choice Megan had made and assumed everyone else would live with. "I didn't come here to argue," I said. "I came to be clear." Megan scoffed. "Finally. I won't cover for you," I continued. "I won't lie for you. And I won't pretend this was about protecting anyone." She tilted her head. "So you're choosing this over us?" "I'm choosing the truth," I said. "You're the one who turned it into sides." My father looked at me, then really looked like he was seeing something he'd avoided for years. "You didn't do this," he said quietly. "No," I replied. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "We did." Megan laughed again, this time louder. "Don't be dramatic." My mother stood up. "Get your things." Megan froze. "What?" "You heard me." My mother said, her voice steady now. "You need to leave." "This is ridiculous," Megan snapped. You're taking her side. I'm taking responsibility, my mother replied. Megan turned to me, eyes sharp. Enjoy it. You always wanted to win. I shook my head. This was never about winning. She grabbed her coat and stormed past me, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the cabinets. The silence that followed felt different. Heavier. Honest. My father sank into the chair. I should have asked more questions, he said. Yes, I replied. You should have. My mother reached for my hand. I'm sorry. I squeezed her fingers once. I know. When I left the house, the sky was already dark. The porch light cast a weak circle on the driveway. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool air, letting the weight of the conversation settle, without trying to organize it into something cleaner than it was. Inside the car, I sat with the engine running and thought about how long lies can hold together when everyone agrees not to pull too hard on the threads, and how fast they unravel once someone finally does. The chair felt colder than it looked, hard plastic pressed flat against my back, as I sat down and placed the folder on my lap. The room wasn't a courtroom, not exactly. No jury box, no raised bench, just a long table, neutral walls, a flag in the corner, and people who had learned how to keep their faces unreadable for a living. Military review boards favor function over drama. The setup was intentional. Facts don't need staging. Across the table, Megan sat stiffly. Hands folded, eyes fixed straight ahead. She wore a blazer that looked chosen for credibility, not comfort. My parents sat behind her close enough to feel involved, far enough to avoid responsibility. No one spoke to anyone else. An officer called the session to order and explained the scope. Administrative review. Financial irregularities. Allegations of misconduct. The words were clinical, stripped of emotion. That was fine with me. Emotion had already done enough damage. They started with timelines. I handed over my documents when asked. Orders. Travel logs. GPS verification tied to duty locations. The analyst walked the panel through it, calmly pointing to dates, coordinates, and system records that couldn't be argued without inventing a conspiracy. These entries are generated automatically, he said. There's no indication of manual alteration. One of the panel members nodded and made a note. Then they moved to the accounts. A financial investigator displayed transaction histories on the screen. Account openings under my mother's name. Transfers spaced just far enough apart to avoid immediate flags. Access points traced to devices I didn't own and locations I wasn't in. None of these transactions originated from Captain Pierce's devices, he said. Megan shifted in her chair. They asked her to explain. She cleared her throat. I was trying to protect my family. There was pressure. I didn't think it would go this far. Why was law enforcement involved? One panel member asked. Megan glanced toward my parents. I was advised it was the right way to handle it. By whom? She hesitated. By people who understood the situation. That answer didn't land the way she wanted it to. They played the audio Megan had submitted with the complaint. A clipped explanation of concern. Missing funds. Fear that I might misuse my position. It sounded reasonable until it sat next to the data. Then came the messages, screenshots of texts Megan had sent. Not all of them, just enough. Phrases like "she'll be fine" and "this won't touch her career" appeared on the screen in neutral font, stripped of context but heavy with implication. One panel member looked up. You were aware of the potential consequences for Captain Pierce when you initiated this. Megan nodded once. I didn't think. That's not the question, the panel member said. Were you aware? Yes. That was the first crack that didn't close. They asked me to speak. I stood, hands at my sides, posture automatic. Years of briefings had trained my body to stay still when my mind was focused. I did not authorize any accounts under my mother's name, I said. I did not transfer any funds. I did not request anyone contact law enforcement on my behalf. My location during every alleged transaction is verifiable through duty logs. No embellishment. No defense beyond facts. They asked why I hadn't reported the family conflict earlier. Because it was personal, I replied. Until it wasn't. The hearing moved on. Metadata analysis. Device access. Handwriting comparison on signed forms. The expert didn't speculate. He simply pointed out inconsistencies. Smooth signatures where my father's hand now shook. access timestamps that aligned with Megan's phone records. My father lowered his head. My mother stared at the floor. When Megan was questioned again, her answers shortened. I was under stress. I didn't think it mattered. I thought she'd understand. Understand that she'd been offered up as collateral. The room stayed quiet. No gasps, no reactions, just pens moving. Finally, the panel asked us to wait outside. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. I leaned against the wall and focused on my breathing, not because I was nervous, but because it was habit. Megan stood a few feet away, arms crossed, jaw tight. You didn't have to do all this, she muttered. I looked at her. Neither did you, she scoffed. You could have fixed it quietly. I didn't break it, I replied. She turned away. When they called us back in the panel, didn't waste time. The review has concluded, the officer said. The allegations against Captain Pierce are unsubstantiated. Evidence indicates the complaint was based on fabricated or misrepresented information. The words settled into the room without ceremony. My access would be restored. The complaint would be closed. No further action against me. They turned to Megan. This matter will be referred for separate review. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I didn't look at her when the session ended. I didn't need to. The outcome was clear enough. Outside, the sky was overcast, low and gray. My parents approached slowly, unsure of what to say now that silence wasn't an option. I'm sorry, my father said. I should have asked more questions. Yes, I said. You should have. My mother reached for me, then stopped herself. I never wanted this. I know, I replied, and I meant it. Megan walked past us without a word, heels clicking sharply against the floor, each step fast and controlled, like she could outrun what had just happened if she moved quickly enough. I stood there for a moment longer, then turned toward the exit. The building doors opened automatically, cool air rushing in as I stepped outside the weight I'd been carrying for weeks, easing just enough to let me breathe normally again. The truth hadn't been dramatic. It hadn't been loud. It had simply been thorough, and that was enough. The badge reader chirped green again 2 weeks later, the sound sharp and ordinary, like it had always been. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, not because I was unsure, but because I noticed the absence of tension. No pause, no warning screen, just access restored without commentary. That was how things usually worked when the truth finished its job. Inside, nothing looked different. Same hallways, same break room coffee that tasted burned no matter who made it. A few people nodded as I passed. One colleague gave me a quick thumbs up and went back to her screen. No speeches, no congratulations. The military doesn't celebrate when systems work. It just moves on. I did too. My supervisor called me in later that morning, closed the door, and slid a document across the desk. Clearance reinstated. Full duties resumed. She met my eyes. You handled that professionally, she said. I handled it honestly, I replied. She smiled once. That helps. What didn't come back right away was the noise. The weeks of second-guessing. The sense that every silence carried weight. That part faded slower, but it did fade. Work filled the space it left behind. Schedules, briefings, problems that had solutions instead of motives. At home, things were quieter in a different way. My parents called occasionally. Short conversations. No rewriting of history. Just updates. Weather. Doctor appointments. My mother apologized more than once, each time sounding a little less like she was asking to be forgiven, and a little more like she was accepting what couldn't be undone. Megan didn't call. I didn't block her. I didn't need to. Silence worked better when it wasn't forced. One evening, Caleb and I sat on the back porch watching the sun dip behind the houses across the street. He handed me a beer, leaned back, and asked the question people usually wait too long to ask. Do you miss them? He said. I thought about it. About the version of my family that existed before control replaced trust. I miss who I thought they were, I said. Not who they turned out to be. He nodded like that made sense. Because it did. A month later, an email landed in my inbox from a name I hadn't seen in years. Lydia Martinez. One of the trainees I'd mentored early in my career. She'd struggled back then, lost her father young, questioned whether she belonged. We'd talked more than once after long days sitting on the steps outside the building because it was easier to breathe out there. She wrote that she was getting married. Then she asked if I'd walk her down the aisle. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. When I told Caleb, he smiled. That sounds about right. The day of the wedding was warm. Spring had finally settled in the kind that feels earned after a long winter. The church was small, simple, filled with people who looked like they wanted to be there. Lydia waited near the entrance, hands shaking just slightly. She laughed when she saw me. "I know it's not traditional," she said. "Neither am I replied. When the music started, she slipped her arm through mine. The doors opened, light spilling in across the floor. As we walked, I caught glimpses of faces turning toward us, smiling, expectant. No empty rows, no confusion. Halfway down the aisle, Lydia leaned in and whispered, "Thank you for showing up." The words landed harder than anything said in that hearing room weeks earlier. Harder than apologies. Harder than verdicts. I squeezed her arm once, always. After the ceremony, people gathered outside, laughing, taking photos, doing all the normal things that happen when nothing goes wrong. I stood off to the side with Caleb, watching Lydia spin in her dress as someone adjusted her veil. For the first time in a while, my phone stayed in my pocket. Later that night back home, I hung my uniform jacket carefully in the closet and closed the door. The folder that had followed me for weeks sat untouched on the shelf above it. I didn't throw it away. I didn't need to. Proof doesn't disappear just because you stop needing it. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the word revenge. How people expect it to look loud, messy, satisfying in obvious ways. This hadn't been that. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations in parking lots, no last words delivered with perfect timing, just facts, consequences, and the quiet decision not to carry someone else's damage anymore. Megan had wanted leverage. She'd wanted control. She'd wanted me small enough to manage. What she got instead was distance, the kind that doesn't announce itself but doesn't close either. I couldn't choose the family I was born into. That part had never been up for debate. But I could choose who I stood beside, who I protected, who I trusted with my name and my future. The military taught me discipline. It taught me structure. It taught me how to function under pressure. This experience taught me something else. Showing up isn't about obligation. It's about intention. And once you understand the difference, you stop chasing people who only value you when they can use you. I turned off the light, settled back against the pillows, and let the quiet be just that. Not heavy, not empty, just calm. I used to believe family was defined by blood and obligation. Now I know it's defined by who shows up when it actually matters. This wasn't about winning or revenge. It was about protecting the life I built, the career I earned, and the truth when it was easier for others to bury it. Family drama has a way of revealing who values control over connection, and sometimes the strongest family revenge stories don't end with anger, they end with clarity. If stories about family betrayal, military life, and quiet revenge speak to you, consider subscribing to the channel. These are real-feeling family revenge stories about choices, consequences, and finding strength when blood turns against you.